Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another sermon at Nazarene Way Church. Now, full disclaimer, as I am speaking up here and conducting my sermon, you may see some footage which is unfortunate, and that is my cat, Mr. Brodus. He likes to hop up here and he likes to swipe at my tzitzits, which are the tassels, the reminders, the fringes that Jesus of Nazareth wore and all of his disciples wore. You can actually see these hidden in plain sight if you watch the series on Amazon Prime known as The Chosen. There's an episode in which a woman tugs at the fringes of Jesus's cloak. And this is a story written about in the Gospels. And if you actually, look back, it's not just fringes, it's the tzitzits. The Hebrews, the Jews, wore these as reminders of all of the, I think there's like 613 laws in the Torah. And, I prefer to simplify it and a little bit, wherein you're going to find out about that at the very end of this sermon. And, Jesus, it revolves around something that he spoke about in Matthew, essentially. And he hangs the two most important laws upon two laws that he outlines. And we'll get into that in a little bit later in this sermon. Now, here is the title of this sermon. It's going to be a little bit about history. And also, if I have to catch my breath, I'm going through, kind of fighting through a cold. I've also given the cold to my son, Fitzy, so I'm fighting through it. And so I may have to, sniffle a few times and, whatever. We're just going to frickin' wing it and see where we go from here. Now, here's the thing. The title of this sermon is A Look at the Messages of the Failed Messiahs. And it starts out with this fact. And that fact is this. There were many who lived around the time of Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah. It wasn't unique to be a Messiah. A lot of people think that, oh my gosh, Jesus was the first of the Messiahs to finally come forth and to be proclaimed himself a Messiah of the Jewish people or of the Hebrews. And actually we find in Josephus and his writings, Josephus, literally viewed them, those who claimed to be messiahs, as charlatans, as people who were even more dangerous than any of the rebels, even the Sicarii, because they claimed to do, quote-unquote magic tricks and be magicians, right? That is, what was essentially the reputation of messiahs and these characters. And so we're going to go back in time, and I'm going to share with you the most noteworthy and notable of the messiahs who lived around the time of Jesus of Nazareth. And then, how we're going to end this is we're going to reflect on, and I'm going to essentially give you some food for thought, to ask yourself the question of why did the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, become hands down the most famous and well-known human being in our 200,000 years of history and existence as a species. Hands down, Jesus of Nazareth is the most famous human being and most well-known human being. Okay? Way more well-known than Muhammad. People don't know Muhammad's story, right? Way more well-known than Buddha, whose real name was Siddhartha Gautama, who was an actual prince who ran away because he was, spoiled rotten, and he didn't like to be spoiled rotten, and so he wanted to go find himself and, sit under a Bodhi tree for like 7 years straight and meditate. Everyone knows about Jesus of Nazareth, the most popular, well-known human being to ever exist in history, the most successful Messiah by far, compared to the messiahs I'm about to introduce you to, who were, in their time, probably actually even more popular than Jesus of Nazareth was. So we're going to look at these 5 different messiahs, these quote-unquote failed messiahs. We're going to understand their message, their story, when they existed, and then we're going to reflect on why Jesus of Nazareth perhaps was significantly more popular and became the most well-known human being to ever live. Okay? So the first failed Messiah I want to introduce you to is named Hezekiah the Bandit Chief. And Hezekiah was a Jewish rebel leader and outlaw who led a resistance against the Hasmonean rule, or possibly early Roman authorities. He was seen as a proto-messianic figure due to his opposition to foreign rule. Okay, notice the opposition to foreign rule. That is a common theme here. Jesus, was opposed to the foreign rule. He was anti-accommodationist, as was his brother James the Just, and as was the line that survived after Jesus, his actual family line. As we know, Jesus had actual biological brothers, like Jude, Simon, Simeon, son of Clophas or Cleophas, however it's pronounced, who also, there's some people that say that was also the same as Simon, the brother of Jesus. And, also the Essene community, the people who lived and existed in the Qumran caves around which created the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were completely anti-accommodationist, meaning the Romans conquered their area and they were anti-accommodationist. And Jesus, also opposed foreign rule. Now, he went about it in a different way. Okay? This is a theme we'll come across. Now, Hezekiah the Bandit Chief, the time period in which he lived was the late 1st century BCE. So it was right before Herod the Great's rule. And, Herod the Great was the most horrific, brutal leader. He called himself the King of the Jews, even though, he was really, you have to read into his history, like half Jewish. He killed many of his wives. He killed, right before he died, he wanted his funeral to be a bloodbath in which he killed his sons. And it's absurd when you read into his history. Now, the core message of Hezekiah the Bandit Chief was his resistance against oppressive rulers, likely with an emphasis on restoring Jewish independence. Okay? And the reason why his message failed is he was captured and executed by Herod the Great before he could build a larger following. His movement lacked deep theological roots and was primarily seen as political banditry rather than a transformative religious message. There's another thing we're going to come back to. We're going to come back to something in which, and I want you to pay close attention to this. The higher level message, okay, it's also kind of known as a mandate from heaven, in which Jesus essentially hung his entire message on, was all based around deep theological understanding, and he was a student of knowing the prophecies and knowing the texts. Whereas these other individuals, their entire movement hung on political messages. They did not have an underlying mandate from heaven that moved and promoted a message that was above the quote-unquote flesh, above the actual, human being in existence. So, I want to introduce you to the next failed Messiah, and that is Judas the Galilean. And this is interesting. We're going to come back to this here too in a moment. Is Judas the Galilean was a Jewish leader who led a tax revolt against the Romans in response to the census of Quirinius. He founded the Zealot movement, which advocated for violent resistance against Rome. The time period was around 6 CE. Okay, notice one thing. He was from Galilee, which is precisely in the county, the area, essentially, where Jesus of Nazareth was from. right? I've been to Nazareth. I've been to Galilee and the Sea of Galilee. It's all really close together, right? And it is very probable that Jesus's parents and extended relatives were all very familiar with Judas the Galilean. Now, Judas the Galilean, his core message was a total rejection of Roman rule. Once again, the political message, right? Seeing it as incompatible with Jewish faith. Only God was the true king. He promoted the idea that paying taxes to Rome was blasphemous. And that's what really got him killed. They went after him. And you can read about this. I think the Romans at the time, I think it was Sepphoris, is how it's pronounced. There was this, the head city, the capital, right near where Jesus lived in Nazareth, wherein his family probably worked and did a lot of day labor work as tectons or, carpenters. They weren't carpenters just making wood. They were tectons. They were essentially independent contractors and builders, right? Rome got so pissed off at Judas the Galilean that they came down and they not only stopped his rebellion, they also burned Sepphoris. I believe it's pronounced. You can look into this if you want to, do some Wikipedia research. Right, burned it to the ground. All right, and his message failed because his rebellion was swiftly crushed and his followers were scattered. His movement, the Zealots, persisted, but ultimately led to the disastrous Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70 CE, which ended in the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. His message was highly nationalistic and lacked a universal appeal. That's one thing that you will find in the different message between the message of Yeshua of Nazareth, aka known as Jesus of Nazareth, and these other failed messiahs, is the failed messiahs, their message, all it cared about was that, hey, we Jewish people are special. God only cares about the Jewish people, the Israelites, right? The Hebrews, right? Israelites, by the way, Israel. El is actually the first. If you go and read Genesis and Exodus, you'll find that the God is El, E-L, Elohim. That's the name of God. Israel means people of El. Isra, people of El is El. So this individual said, no, God only cares about Israel, his people, right? The Jewish people. Furthermore, here's what's interesting is, do you notice, if you look at the family names of Jesus' siblings, we have, Jesus had 4 brothers. Judas, otherwise known as Jude, and the Epistle of Jude is in the New Testament. It's kind of absconded to the back and try to be written out of history. So we've got Jude, we've got James the Just, the eldest brother and leader of the Jerusalem church. Then we've got Joseph, or Joses, and then we've got Simon, who also might be Simon the Zealot, right? Simon the Zealot. You've probably heard Simon the Zealot. He was of the Zealot movement. He carried around a dagger. They were called, Sicari. Sicari means is assassin. Maybe, in Spanish, Sicario is assassin. That's also a fantastic movie, Sicario, if you haven't seen it. And so, isn't it funny that, the Zealot movement, Simon the Zealot, and the most notable messianic figure was Judas the Galilean, whose Mary named one of her sons Judas, probably as a sign of reverence because they respected Judas. Because, look, it was like this was right around Judas and the Galilean. This rebellion existed right around the time that Jesus was born. And so they learned from the mistakes of these failed messiahs what message worked, what message did not work. All right, then there's Menahem. And Menahem was a descendant of Judas the Galilean. Menahem became a zealot leader during the First Jewish-Roman War. He briefly seized control of Jerusalem and claimed messianic authority. So the time period was around 66 to 70 CE. So we can assume that Menahem and James the Just, James the brother of Jesus, probably crossed, there's maybe a chance that they crossed paths. It would be unlikely that they did not hear of one another. Very unlikely. And it would be very unlikely that Menahem was not familiar with the emerging nascent movement of Jesus of Nazareth, aka the Nazarenes, or internally they called themselves People of the Way. The core message of Menahem was liberation of Judea from Roman rule and the establishment of a messianic kingdom. He likely saw himself as the true king of the Jews. Okay? There's also this obsession to be the king of the Jews, the king of the Jews. That means you are of the line, the Davidic line, because the Messiah, the Son of God, as outlined in the prophecies in Isaiah and in like Jeremiah and some of the Hebrew biblical texts say that the Messiah will be of the bloodline of David, and they will be called the King of the Jews. So his message failed because his brutal tactics alienated even fellow rebels. He was assassinated by rival factions in Jerusalem, showing the deep divisions among the Jewish resistance. His movement lacked unity and spiritual depth. Let's talk about the fourth Messiah, the fourth failed Messiah, and that is Simon, son of Giora. And Simon, son of Giora, was another Jewish rebel leader during the First Jewish-Roman War. Simon led a large force against both the Romans and rival Jewish factions. He was one of the last defenders of Jerusalem. So he existed in that, famous war 66 to 70 CE, of which the temple of Jerusalem, the centerpiece of which God existed in Jerusalem. They went to see God, right? In the temple of Jerusalem. And it was crushed, it was killed, it was burned to the ground, right? And he was one of the final messianic figures up until we get to the next one, which is, this one is an interesting one. So the core message of Simon, son of Giora, is military resistance against Rome, with a possible messianic claim of kingship over Israel. He presented himself as the liberator of the people. So the reason why his message failed is after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, he was captured and executed by the Romans. His movement was focused on violent resistance, which was ultimately crushed. His lack of a transcendent spiritual message limited his long-term impact. So notice, all of these failed messiahs declared themselves king of the Jews, but they did not have a deep theological understanding of Scripture, and they were so focused on violent tactics, anti-Roman. There was no compromise. All right, this takes us to the final failed Messiah, which is Simon, son of Kokba, otherwise known as Bar Kokhba. This individual is fascinating and interesting. I actually, several months ago, went up to the Reagan Library in LA, where there was a display of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also on display were some coins around the early 2nd century, aka the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And Bar Kokhba, this individual, actually made his own coins, his own currency. He said, "To hell with you, Rome. We're not using in Caesar. We're not using your coins. We're not using your money. We're inventing and creating our own currency. We do not, want anything to do with you." And Bar Kokhba was the leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome. Many Jews, including Rabbi Akiva, saw him as the Messiah. He established a brief independent Jewish state between 132 and 135 CE. Now, his core message was military liberation and restoration of Jewish rule over Judea. He was seen as a warrior Messiah who would defeat Rome and rebuild the temple. His rebellion was brutally suppressed, leading to massive Jewish casualties and the renaming of Judea to Palestina by the Romans. His messianic claim was tied to military victory, so his defeat discredited him. Do you see how all of these messianic figures were all tied to creating essentially a movement that also declared themselves as of the Davidic line, but most importantly, they created the movement that was architected and focused on using violence as their method, as their force. And the only way in which their prophecy of and claim to being Messiah could succeed is if they defeated the outsiders, aka those that are not people of God, those that are not Israel, people of El, people of God. It was all highly political. It was all focused on the actual, quote-unquote, real world, the physical world, and not the, quote, metaphysical world, which is meta means above, the Greek term for above, and then metaphysical, metaphysio, right? Above the physical realm. No. Jesus' message all existed in a kingdom, which we'll get to in a second, kingdom of heaven, not a kingdom of earth. Not a Jerusalem kingdom, not a kingdom that these individuals fought for, like Simon, son of Kokba. You know what's interesting is the Simon, son of Kokba, the reason, and we'll go back to this, the reason that the Nazarenes died out, Nazarenes were the original followers of Jesus of Nazareth, right? His own disciples, James the Just, his brothers, they were all Nazarenes. That's how they were known to outsiders. Internally, they called themselves people of the way, and we find this in Acts. Now, what's interesting is one of the primary reasons that the Nazarenes died off is because of Bar Kokhba himself. You see, after the death of Jesus, there was the head of the Jesus movement existed in the Jerusalem church. It existed with James the Just, the brother of Jesus. He became the ruler. He was the head bishop, and he had two other pillars. They made up the three pillars of Jerusalem. His second pillar, the second guy in command, was named Sepha, otherwise known as a rock. Sepha, it means rock in Hebrew and Aramaic, or Kepha, all right? And that is Peter, right? Peter. And then there's John. He was the other pillar. And what happened is after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jews were completely banished from Jerusalem. They could only, and you can find this, they were only allowed to go out at a certain time period and look out at Jerusalem from a faraway distance, at under observation. They were not allowed inside the gates or allowed near Jerusalem. And what this did is this scattered and created a diaspora of the Hebrews, of the people of El, the Jews, who scattered all over the near Middle East and all over the place. And so the Nazarenes, instead of having a home base in Jerusalem, they were not allowed to go back to Jerusalem. And in fact, the only people of the Jerusalem church at the time that were allowed to teach were those who were, quote-unquote, circumcised, the Gentiles. So they essentially did not allow any Jewish Christians, quote-unquote Christians, aka Nazarenes, to essentially teach or be in any synagogue, because they feared that the Jewish people, and by the way, in the eyes of the Romans, in the eyes of the Hellenistic Greeks and all of those individuals, they could not make a distinction between Nazarenes, people who believed in Yeshua of Nazareth, the Messiah, and Jewish people, the Hebrews and the people of El, the Israelites. Because the Hebrews, it was also very confusing at the time. There was like 4 main schools and sects of Hebrews and of Jews, right? There were the Sadducees, which were really the Herodian Jews. These were the people that ran the temple at the time and were like very rich and wealthy because they took payments from the crazy psychopath, quote unquote king of the Jews named Herod. Then there were the Pharisees, who because they got so much hate and they were thrown under the bus in the Gospels later on by the, Hellenistic Greek writers of the Gospels, the Pharisees actually in the medieval times had a rebranding. They're now known in modern day and age as Orthodox Jews. And then there were the Essenes, and these were people that basically lived out in the wilderness, in caves. They did a lot of water immersion practices to repent and cleanse themselves from sins. And we find their texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And likely, there's some scholars, and the probability that this is true is some scholars have found and argue that John the Baptist was an Essene or was influenced by the Essenes, right? John the Immerser, water immersion, because that came from Essenes. And then the fourth school is what the fourth philosophy that Josephus outlines. Josephus was a Jewish historian that wrote, essentially, his patron, the people that paid him, were the Greeks, so he kind of wrote for the Greeks and had a bias towards the Greeks, and he hated this fourth philosophy. The fourth philosophy was called the Zealots, the Zealot movement. The Zealot movement, there's actually a lot of argument that some people think that Jesus was part of the Zealot movement. There's no definitive evidence. There is a fantastic book by Reza Aslan called Zealot, and he argues that Jesus was a zealot. We know that Jesus' family was probably, widely influenced by the Zealot movement. Maybe Jesus' brother Simon, who may also be Simon the Zealot, was also a zealot, right? So we know that Jesus was close with the Zealots. That was the fourth philosophy. Well, with Jesus, essentially, being the Son of Man, okay, Ben Adam in Aramaic, he was the fifth philosophy, right? So for Romans and Hellenistic Greeks, it was hard for them to keep all of this, in their head. They just lumped all the five of these characters into one bucket called Jews. So Nazarenes, as we know, Jesus was called a Jew. He wasn't a Jew. He was a Nazarene, okay? So it's a distinction. But, just for simplicity, they just lumped him into the bucket of being Jews. And they banished all Jews from Jerusalem and that area after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And this wasn't a problem for the emerging movement called the Hellenistic, movement called Christianity, because Christians were scattered all over Greece, thanks to Paul. And so they kind of crafted and concocted their own type of view of this religion of Jesus of Nazareth. They were called Christianos. Christos is essentially Messiah in Greek. And so they flourished because there was no longer any Jerusalem home base, because James the Just was killed, and Jews and the Nazarenes were barred from their home base in Jerusalem thanks to Bar Kokhba. So almost like a perfect storm had to happen to create this massive movement called Christianity. All right. So the next question is this. What was the core message of Jesus of Nazareth, i.e. the most well-known human being to ever live in our 200,000-year history as a species of Homo sapiens? What was his message, and what was distinct about it that made this essentially what he's been called a marginal Jew, a small insignificant Jew, a poor Galilean in the even poorer town of Nazareth, which was essentially like white mud huts at the time? How did this frickin' crazy individual with 4 brothers, 2 sisters unnamed, born to Mary, right, and Joseph, how did he become the most famous human being to ever exist in history? Well, unlike all these other failed messiahs, Jesus' message was quite distinct and different. Now, here are the 3 most important laws of Jesus' message. And we find this in Matthew 22, verse 34, is when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. Okay, now let's point out, when the Orthodox Jews, which were, believe it or not horrible people, okay? There's a lot of hate to the Pharisees. Guess who wrote those stories? It was Hellenistic Pauline writers and his secretaries, trying to place blame on the Pharisees. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were actually probably more likely the evil ones. They're really just Herodian Jews. That's how you should think of them. They were very wealthy, highly paid, under-the-table, corrupt Jews, like the high priest, right? So when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, meaning Jesus, to test him. He said, "Teacher, Rabbi," is what he said. "Rabbi, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love your Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So I told you that, these tzitzits represent, if you add up and multiply the number of strings, the 613 laws of the Torah, right? Now, it's kind of hard to remember all the 613 laws of the Torah. And therefore, what I like to remind myself and think about is that when you wear these tzitzits, because there's 4 of them, it means that you should love God with all your heart. That's one. With all your soul is another one. With all your mind is another one, right? And then the last commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. So there's 4 things, right? Okay. Now, the other most important law, we find this from James, right? The actual brother of Jesus. The Epistle of James is essentially a book in the Bible absconded to the very last piece in the Catholic canonical order, which was essentially invented in the late 4th century. They listed out 27 books that they believed to be canon and worthy, and then they absconded and castigated the other ones. And James said, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." Why? Why be justified by works? Why carry all this stuff out? Well, the number one piece of not only Jesus' message, but essentially his mentor and the one that paved the way for him, meaning the way. And this is actually outlined in Isaiah. There will be 2 messiahs. One will bring the way, one will pave the way, right, for the coming Messiah. It was all about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is coming. Jesus was known as an apocalyptic Jew. Eschatological is his message, meaning the end times are coming. There's an argument that Jesus actually believed the end times were coming in his lifetime. Now, we know, because we're still here, that it didn't necessarily come in his lifetime, but were the prophets and was the law fulfilled in his lifetime? Yes. Did it start? Probably. The whole kingdom of heaven concept is fascinating. You see, Jesus' core message, as we can see, the reason why he is the most popular individual, human being to ever lived, is because his message was a mandate from heaven. It was above the political realm. All of the other 5 failed messiahs that I outlined, when they were killed, when they murdered, their claim to being a messiah was also murdered and killed. Jesus, his message was above the realm of the flesh, of being human. And that is one of the most important things, I think, to think about. Now, why was Jesus' message so successful? Every single one of those other failed messiahs, they were not above the physical realm. They were not metaphysical. They said, no, Romans need to be abolished. We need to extinguish them. They are evil. God is only for us, Israel, people of El. No one else matters, right? Whereas Jesus' message was all about love, and loving your neighbor as yourself. And when the Romans, there's that one parable or that one story in which Roman law at the time, you were allowed to, the Romans were allowed to take off their gear and give it to a Jew and say, hey, carry this. And then they had to carry it a mile for the Romans. And Jesus said, there's that famous line of, hey, if they ask you to carry their gear for a mile, you walk an extra mile. We love them even more. We do not commit violence towards our enemy. We commit love towards our enemy. And that is the most gangster move out there. I'm sure that in your life you can think of some enemies, some people that are just complete and utter tools, let's just call it, or some spineless jellyfish out there. You know, we all have spineless jellyfish that we can think of. I can think of a spineless jellyfish, all right, from my past life. The hardest and craziest thing to do, and just try this, visualize not only yourself being very successful and happy, but your enemies being very successful and happy, and you wanting them to be very successful and happy, and see what happens to your life. That is the core message on which Jesus' message hung. That is a gangster move because it shows that, no, he's not threatened by his enemies. He loves them. He is above them. And he didn't care about restoring or taking back Jerusalem from Roman rule. His strategy was not to banish them through violent means, but through love and nonviolent means, through the exact opposite. And these three laws are one of the reasons that I think Jesus, kind of like Gandhi as well, have become, Jesus became, unlike those failed messiahs, the most popular and well-known human being in history. Anyway, hope you enjoyed today's essentially history lesson and walk through all of the failed messiahs. And Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed this message. And just remember, wear your tzitzits. Wear them around your cats. They like to, smack at them. And also, most importantly, this is the number one pillar of the Nazarene Way Church, or our number one priority, is don't forget the Ebionites, the poor ones. If you come across a homeless person, take action. Don't be like all of the Hawaiian shirt Christians out there that, basically their idea of spirituality and Christianity is to go to church, scratch their balls, go to Islands afterwards or Applebee's and fart away a dinner and not even do or take any action. Live your daily life in the nature and the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth with love, being above your enemies, praying for them, praying for the people that hate you, that persecute you, and see how your life changes. That, my friends, is the gangster move. Peace and love. Hope you enjoyed this sermon, and I will see you next week. Actually, next week I'm going on vacation, so I'll see you the following week. Peace.